Selecting and unselecting an object in Blender is pretty straightforward. Right now you can probably tell by just looking that the cube is selected right now. The clues that give it away are the fact that it has this orange outline. You can even see over here it's highlighted in a different color. The word cube itself is the same shade of orange as it is over here. And if that's not enough, we actually see the word cube here and all of its information listed down below. That's inside the Object Properties tab. So straight out of the box, I think it's pretty easy to tell that the cube is selected. You might even be able to figure out without any instructions whatsoever that you can left click on another object to select that object. So right now the light is selected. You can see that it's in orange. You see all the light's properties down here. I can extend that over here to this camera. Same thing. So I can easily just left click to change to any other object. Okay, so how do you unselect? Well, again, you could probably figure this out without any instructions at all. Just left clicking outside any one of these objects will unselect all the objects. So let's go ahead and select the cube again. There's other ways you can unselect too. A couple of keyboard shortcuts. Alt-A will unselect all. Or double tapping A, like that. Now when I did that, you might have noticed that the first time I hit A, it selected all. So if I double tap A, it selects all and then unselects all. So just to recap, we can select any object by left clicking. We can unselect all by clicking outside or Alt-A, and then finally double tapping A to unselect all. And of course we also know how to select all now by just hitting A. What if you wanted to select just a couple of objects? Say for example, the cube and the light. Well, there's a couple of ways you could do that. Right now we're using this box selection tool. By the way, if you have anything else selected, go ahead and select on Select Box. And then you can just draw a box around the objects that you want to select. So I'm going to go ahead and unselect all again, and then draw a box around these two objects. And then we'll do the same thing over here. What if I wanted to select the light and the camera? The box select isn't really going to allow me to do that, is it? There's other selection options over here, like lasso select. So with lasso select, I can kind of draw in and around things pretty easily. And then we have another option over here called circle select. This works kind of like a paintbrush. I'm going to go ahead and unselect all. Let's use Alt-A this time. So like I said, like a paintbrush, you're just going to paint over these objects. So I'm holding it on my left mouse button and just painting over them. Now it's not the object itself, it's the origin of the object that you have to paint over. So all of this doesn't do anything. It's only when I get to that orange dot right there, which if it's not selected, you don't even see the dot. So this can be a little tricky sometimes. The orange dot you can see over here. So when I actually go into it, you can see that it selects it with this circle selection tool. And then finally, there's another tool over here called Tweak. And this allows you to just point and click. It doesn't have any dragging options at all. In other words, you can't do something like drag and make a rectangle or a lasso or anything like that. Tweak just allows point and click. It has a secondary function to move things. So like if I click on this, I can click and drag to move that. Which, by the way, if you don't want to do that, you can just right click to set it back down. Okay, let's put this back on box. And I want to point out another way that you can multi-select objects. So right now we have just the cube selected. If I hold in on Shift and left click on the light, it'll add the light to the selection. You can see it over here. And obviously the colored outlines give it away too. Shift click on the camera. Now we have all three selected. So that allows us to do something like this. I'm going to go ahead and unselect all. Left click on the camera. Shift click on the light. Now we have both of those selected, but not the cube. So now it's time for you to actually get some practice on this stuff. Go in here, practice selecting, practice unselecting, selecting all, shift selecting to add more selections, and then obviously play around with some of these tools. Another thing I want to mention too is when you hover over tools in Blender, you'll see the keyboard shortcut if there is one available. The keyboard selection for this is W. So if I happen to be in a different tool and I hit W, it'll go back to this tool. Doesn't matter which one you're on. That'll probably come in handy later on because most of the time we want to keep this on the selection tool. These tools are good while you're using them, but when you're not using them, it's always a good idea to go back to this selection tool. There's one more thing I want to point out in this lecture, and I think it's a little bit more complicated. So if you have a hard time wrapping your head around this, just keep in mind, most of the time we're not going to need to know about this. And what we're talking about here is the active object. Blender uses this active object sometimes, mostly behind the scenes, but every once in a while we do something where we actually need to know which of these objects is the active object. And another way to think about the active object is it's basically the last object that you've selected. So right now you see everything is unselected, but one of these three things is the active object. And here's a couple of visual cues that give that away. First of all, this orange dot. None of the other objects have it. That orange dot is called the origin, and when it's colored in that lighter shade of orange, that indicates that that object is currently the active object. It's the last thing that I've selected. A couple of other things that give that away is over here, you can see that the icon has that light gray background behind it. And then one final thing is over here in the Object Properties tab, the active object is always going to be the object that's listed here. Now, you're probably wondering what this whole active object thing is, and I'm just going to give you an example so you can sort of wrap your head around it and understand why we need this in the first place. So try to imagine you have a scene where you have like two different objects, maybe two different cubes that you want to sort of join together as one object. Later on, we're going to learn about the join tool, but for now, just try to visualize this. You've got two objects. Let's call them object A and object B. And what you want to do is you want to join them together so that they become one object. Well, what is that new object going to be named? Is Blender going to call it object A, or is it going to call it object B? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. Whichever of those two objects is the active object will determine what the name of the new joined object is going to be. So if we selected object A first, and then we selected object B second, object B becomes the active object, because remember, the last selected object is the active object. So if object B was the active object and we joined object A and B together, the name of the newly joined object is going to be object B. Again, you don't really need to know much about this right now. Later on in the course, when it becomes relevant, it'll make more sense to you. But for now, I just wanted to kind of point out that there is this thing called the active object, and basically what it is the last selected object. Finally, one more thing. Hopefully this doesn't throw you off balance, but the active object is not always selected. So if I shift and click on the cube again, it's not selected, but it's still the active object. The light is selected. This is not selected. The cube is not selected, but the cube is still the active object. You can see it over here, and you can see it has the highlight behind the icon, and the origin is in that lighter shade of orange. Let's do a quick recap, and then we'll end this lecture. So, left-clicking on an object selects it. Selecting outside of an object will unselect all. You can also use Alt-A or double-tap A. You can select all by hitting A. If you want to select more, you can use Shift-click to select more, like that. And of course, you can use the Selection Box tool to draw a rectangle around the objects that you want to select. The Lasso tool. And also the Circle tool, which is kind of like a paintbrush. And then finally, we have that Tweak tool. If you ever want to get back to the selection tool, say you've selected another tool, you can always hit W. So go ahead and open up Blender, practice the things that I've just outlined, make sure you understand what's going on, and then when you're ready, I'll meet you in the next lecture. Hello, my name is Billy McDaniel. Welcome to Learn Blender 3D Modeling for Unity Video Game Development. This course is intended for Unity video game developers who would like to learn how to design levels and props in Blender. I've organized this course to help make it easier for you to find specific topics. For example, add a mesh, create a cube, go into edit mode, select a face, extrude, scale, inset, loop cut and slide, add and edit a curve, make 3D text, use the knife tool or the spin tool, smooth, rip region, bridge edge loops, bevel, solidify, proportional editing, mirror editing, common modifiers, popular add-ons, and more. I've also put together sections for low poly prop designs, textures, materials, and UVs, and basic animations. This course is perfect for anyone developing games who wants to improve their skills in 3D modeling. So whether you're new or just hoping to enhance your skills, welcome to Blender. Now, let's start blending. Up until now, we haven't changed our point of view since the beginning of this course. That's going to change right now. So if you hold in on your middle mouse wheel button and move around your mouse, you can finally change your point of view. We're sort of orbiting around this object right now. So when you let go of that button, it's basically going to lock down in that view. You can do the same thing with this gizmo over here. In between all these access points inside this white circle, just click and hold, and now we can orbit using this gizmo instead of using the middle mouse wheel button. So I am holding in on the left mouse button, not holding on the middle this time. So if you want to use the gizmo, you can do that. But if you'd rather just put your mouse out here, you can use the middle mouse wheel button. This is what Blender calls orbiting. If you go to View, Navigation, you can see at the top we have a couple options for orbiting. And each one of these can be clicked, but it also tells you what the keyboard shortcut is for each one of these things. So orbit left, right, up, and down is numpad 4, 6, 8, and 2 respectively. Let's go back out here and try that out. So 4, 6, 8, and 2. You can also hold in on these buttons and it'll basically reach a maximum velocity. And I don't know how long you want to look at that, but definitely go in and practice and try it out. The next thing we're going to want to know is panning. So if I hold in on Shift and use the middle mouse wheel as a button again and move around, you'll see that it's really easy to pan. So Shift, middle mouse wheel button, and you can pan around like this. There's a gizmo for that over here. That's the one that looks like the hand. You don't have to hold Shift, but you can use the left mouse button, push in on that, and pan around like this. And of course, there's a keyboard equivalent for this. Let's go back over here to View, Navigation, and you see pan left, right, up, and down. It's basically holding in on Control and using 4, 6, 8, and 2. So Control 4, Control 6, Control 8, and Control 2. And just as the other one works, you can also hold in on this and it'll sort of go at a maximum velocity. It's all incrementally snapped, but it comes in handy once in a while. Let's move on. The next thing I want to point out is zooming in and out. So with a mouse, you're just going to roll the mouse wheel up to zoom in and back to zoom out. Pretty simple. If you want to use a gizmo for this, this is the gizmo right here. It's that little magnifying glass with a plus sign. Just put your mouse inside that gizmo, left click, hold, and move up to zoom in or back to zoom out. Now let's go back to the View Navigation drop down. And you can see that zoom in, zoom out is numpad plus sign or numpad minus sign. I can either click on these or I can use the minus sign or the plus sign. Great. Let's take a look at that menu again. So View, Navigation. For now, let's talk about rolling left and rolling right. So now we're going to use Shift in combination with numpad 4 or 6. So rolling looks like this. Shift 4 and Shift 6. Now, since this is incrementally snapped, we can always get back to the center again. So what I mean by that is if you roll this thing around like this and then you start rotating and you're like, whoa, it starts to feel like you're inside a sinking ship. You can always hit Shift and 4 or 6 to get yourself back on track again. And then you'll be rotating properly again. Just remember this. Hold in on the middle mouse wheel button to pivot around like this. Use Shift if you want to pan. And otherwise, the mouse wheel will zoom in and out. Whenever you need to use a keyboard equivalent of any of those things, you can be reminded by going to the View menu under Navigation, and it's all right here. And that's it. I'll see you in the next lecture. I feel like I've used edit mode more than once in this course so far. If I did, I probably chose it from this drop-down list. So I would have gone down here and pressed edit mode, and then done my little business over here, and then came back and chose object mode again. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but there is a shortcut key for this. If you use your mouse to hover over object mode and try to figure out what the shortcut key is, guess what? It's not there. And that's the reason why I wanted to make a lecture for this. So object mode and edit mode, going back and forth or toggling between those two, it's just the tab key. That's all. So if I hit tab, it's going to go to edit mode. Tab again, back to object mode. Notice that this does not cycle through these various options. If you wanted to go back and forth between edit mode and any one of these other options, just choose that option. So let's say, for example, sculpt mode. When I hit tab, it'll go back to edit mode again, and then tab will bring me back to sculpt mode. So now it's a toggle switch between those two modes. So this would change if I selected another one, such as weight paint. It's always edit mode and whichever mode that you selected last. If you want to change it back to object mode, just go back up here and choose object mode. And now it's toggling back and forth that way. I'm not going to go into any depth about the vertex, weight, or texture paint because we're not really going to be using them in this course. However, we will use sculpt from time to time. And so I just want to point out that you'll probably never see me choose sculpt from the drop-down list. And the reason why is because when I do my sculpting, I prefer to go over to the sculpting workspace. And you can see that sculpt is already selected by default over here. And then when I go back to layout, object mode is already selected by default. So when you change to these workspaces, the mode is already selected. We're going to be talking more about workspaces in the next lecture. But for now, I just wanted to make sure that you understood that toggling back and forth between object mode and edit mode is done with the tab key. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to create new objects in Blender using Add Mesh. Now, Add Mesh is just a combination of these two things. This is the Add drop-down menu, and Mesh is one of the items on that list. It has its own set of primitives that you can add. These are 3D objects that you can bring into the scene simply by just clicking on them. There's other things you can add too, like curves, text, metaballs, and all kinds of stuff. But we're just focusing on the Mesh primitive objects in this lecture. Now, there's another way to access this. If you hover over this, you can see that the shortcut is Shift-A. So that means if I put my mouse anywhere out here and I hit Shift-A, that very same menu is going to pop up. That's the same menu over here. Shift-A will bring that up. So we want to go to Add Mesh, and then we're going to be focusing on these primitive objects right now. I think I'll just go from top to bottom. So let's go ahead and create a plane first. There's really not much to say here. A plane is a four-sided shape. It's got 4 vertices, it's got 4 edges, and 1 face right in the middle. I mean, really, let's move on. Let's go ahead and delete that. Shift-A, bring up the Add Mesh menu again, and go to Cube. The cube is probably one of the most versatile objects to work with. You'll find that probably 90% or more of the time, I'm going to be starting my objects as a cube. There's a time and place for everything, and that's the reason why those other primitives are there, but you can literally create just about anything from a cube. Let's go ahead and delete that and move on. Shift-A again. We're going to add a circle this time. A circle is missing any faces. It has edges and vertices, and this has its own practical use as well. I'm not going to be able to go into any great depths about this, but imagine using a circle as a template to design something like a real curvy set of wires or something like that that's laying on the ground. Use your imagination. The circle is actually a very versatile tool if you have a shape that's based around a circle. We'll go ahead and delete that and move on to the next one. There's 2 different types of spheres. We have the UV sphere and the icosphere. I'm going to show you the difference between the two. So we're going to go ahead and bring both of them into the scene at the same time. I'm just going to hit G and move this along the y-axis, and then Shift-A, and we'll create the other, which is an icosphere. I'm going to hit G along the y-axis and put that over here. So now we have 2 different types of spheres. This one was called the UV sphere, and the UV sphere is made up mostly of quads. It's perfect for laying things out flat in a UV space. UV is basically a 2D flat surface. So when you want to put textures on a model, if your object is made up mostly of quads, it's easy to lay it out flat on a grid space. This one over here is called an icosphere. While it doesn't lay out as nicely in a flat 2D plane, it's a lot easier to do things like sculpting. For example, imagine that being the top of a low poly tree. All you really need to do is make it a little bit lumpier, and suddenly that looks like the top of a tree. You get the idea? So they have different applications. They have different usages. We're going to go over these minor details throughout the course. You'll see me using one versus the other here and there. But for now, I just wanted to point out that there is two different types of spheres. One of them, mostly quads. This one, entirely made out of triangles. Let's go ahead and select both of those and delete them and move on to the next object, which is a cylinder. If you wanted to make something like a Coke can or a silo or something like that, you'd probably start from a cylinder. It has a flat top and bottom and a circular circumference. Pretty simple. You can convert a cylinder into other types of shapes, but the idea is that it's a lot more practical to start from a cylinder if that's the shape that you're going for. Let's go ahead and move on. So the next one on the list is what? We have the cone. The cone being very much like a cylinder, except it's only flat on one side and it comes to a point on the other. We all know what a cone is. If you wanted to make something like a pine tree, a party hat, or an ice cream cone or something like that, you might use this primitive shape to start from. Let's go ahead and delete that and move on to the next one. We have the torus. The torus would be a great donut or the knocker on a door. You can reshape this. You can make them thin, fat. There's a lot of things you can do with this. This would be a really hard shape to create from a cube. It's a lot more complex than a cube. So having this as one of the primitive choices is really a good thing. Every once in a while, we'll use a torus. Let's go ahead and move on. Shift A. These last two, separated by a divider, are not really used as primitives so much because you can make a grid out of a plane, and the monkey head is more or less just a test subject or a toy, something to practice learning with. So the grid is the same thing as a plane, except if we were to look at this in edit mode, you'll see that it's subdivided. You can subdivide a plane. This just saves you the step. That's all. Let's go back to object mode and delete that. Finally, we have Suzanne, the monkey head. If you hover over this, you can see construct a Suzanne mesh. Suzanne is Blender's mascot. You've probably seen her before. You can create this monkey head by just Shift A, add mesh, monkey. There's a lot of things you can do with Suzanne. We might use her at some point in the course, but the idea is whenever you're learning something new, bring Suzanne into the scene. Use her as a test monkey. That's what she's there for. She takes a lot of abuse. You can paint her, you can stretch her, you can warp her, you can cut sections out of her ears and her head. Look, no harm is going to come to this monkey, I promise you. She's just a 3D object. But it can be a lot more gratifying working with something like this than a simple cube or a sphere. So get your practice in. Create some of these primitive objects. Practice moving them around. Use this for anything you've learned up till now, as well as anything that you're going to learn throughout the rest of the course. As a matter of fact, throughout the rest of your entire career as a 3D modeler, Suzanne is there to help you practice and learn.